So as you can see, I've gone ahead and repeated the process on these other 3 bars, and that was just using exactly the same techniques as before, just selecting polygons and then rotating them up until this layout looks flat or looks perfectly horizontal in UV space. Now, I didn't have to use the UV Relax tool to get to this point. However, if you feel that it would help you out, by all means go ahead and use it. And if your UV layout doesn't look exactly the same as this, don't panic. Don't spend time trying to match what I have here. The important thing is just that the checkers flow nicely across your object in 3D space. So the thing to look out for is just the flow looking good and kind of the spacing looking good. Now down here we have a little bit of an issue. We can see that the spacing of the checkers is roughly correct, but as we can't see the top and bottom, I'm not quite sure that the angle is exactly what we want. So what we can do is come up to the shader tree, and under our black shiny metal we want to select the checker image that we've applied. Then I'm going to come down to the Properties tab and the Texture Locator option, and we're going to change the horizontal wrap and the vertical wrap from 15 up to 30. And this will have the effect of halving the size of the checkers in our 3D space. And as you can see now, as we can see the top and the bottom of these checkers, we can see exactly what's going on with this angle. And looking at it, you can see it's a little bit higher here, and it kind of dips down a little bit and then comes up a little bit more. And if this was text running across here, I'd want to go in and fix this by coming in. You could select a loop, then find the loop in UV space, and we could just kind of scale this and tweak this a little bit to kind of make sure that the textures are nice and flat and the checkers are all even in 3D space. So we kind of just rotate this guy, maybe move it down a little bit, maybe rotate this one as well. And as you can see over here, things are looking a lot better. The dip has almost completely disappeared. However, as we're not putting text or anything that is a kind of a patterned texture on this, we're just putting random scratches and things, we don't have to worry about doing that too much. A little bit of distortion on a scratch isn't going to be very noticeable. So as long as things look pretty much like this, just flowing fairly nicely across the surface, I think we'll be fine. Now there is one other section I want to take a quick look at, and it's the side of this frame here. Now as you can see, the front of it is slightly angled, but as we're not applying a pattern to this, we don't have to really worry about doing that, although we could just come in and rotate that slightly just to make it look a little bit nicer for the moment. So there you go. So now the front of this is now perfectly square in 3D space. However, this side panel, which is this set of polygons here, are quite obviously a little bit distorted. And the reason is because this set of polygons doesn't look the same in 3D space as it does in 2D space. You can see for one thing that the right side is a little bit higher up than the left side, and also this left side isn't as angled as it is on the right, and in 3D space both of those angles are the same. So it's obviously going to be distorting our texture slightly, so we want to come in and fix that. So I'm going to fix it over here in the left view, and we can keep an eye on this 3D view just to check out what we're doing. So I'm going to come in, and with vertices mode selected, I'm going to select these verts in our UV view, and I'm just going to pull these down slightly, which will straighten out these top 2 edges and just make sure that it's nice and straight across the top there. Then I'm going to come over to the left side here and UV select around these guys, and I'm just going to pull these slightly to the left. And you can see that things are looking a little bit better there, but we're getting a little bit of an overlap here, which suggests that I actually want to undo that and select these verts as well. So we're going to move all 4 of these together. So I'm going to activate the Move tool again and pull them slightly to the left. And you see we're not getting that red overlap warning anymore, so that's a little bit better to see. And what I'm doing is just moving this to the right until this section up here, so above our top selection, looks nice and flat. And that looks a little bit better for me. So I'm going to hit space to drop the Move tool, and then just going to select these 2 inner UVs, or these 2 inner verts here, and we're just going to move those individually to the right. And you can see that this section here is now straightening out a little bit, which looks a little better. So I'm happy with that. Now you can see we're still getting a bit of distortion down towards this end. So I'm going to come in, select these guys, and we're going to try moving these to the right, just decreasing that slope slightly. And you can see the more I do this, the straighter these checkers get in this view. So that looks pretty good, maybe a little bit more. And then I'm just going to individually move these very end ones just slightly to the right. And that gets rid of a little bit more distortion there. So you can see this is a lot better than it was looking before. So that's really just another technique to use. Just come in and manually tweak verts around in UV space to make sure that the texture lines up nicely in 3D space. But you really want to be careful when you do this, because it's very easy to mess things up. And especially, in fact, if I come in here and select this polygon instead of selecting the verts and start moving this, you can see we're actually missing a couple of verts up there, and we really don't want to do that. So it's important to make sure you're selecting everything that you want, and that's why I usually select in vertice mode, because you make sure that you get everything that's hidden underneath these UVs. So with that done, I'm going to go back to our model view, and I'm going to turn from shaded to advanced OpenGL so we can see our checkers. Then I'm going to hit U to unhide our leather polygons, and you can see the results of the work that we've done so far. So now back in items view, we can see that the middle section body and the back door section are now entirely UV'd, and we know that because they're entirely covered in checkers, which is what we're looking for. So we're now going to move on to the top section of the body. So I'm going to bring that up and select it. And now this is obviously a little bit more complicated, so we're going to have to go in and start selecting some edges in here. Now the first thing I usually try before we actually go in and select edges is just to try a UV unwrap as it stands and see exactly how Modo copes with all the individual bits of geometry in here. But you'll notice straight away we have a slight problem. Our body shiny black metal UV map, the one we want to use, is not listed here. It doesn't currently exist for the top section body item. So how do we get access to that UV map? Well, if I come over here to the UV tab and then click the visibility icon next to middle section body, you'll see that a little bit of our UV map does indeed get displayed over here on the left. And the reason for that, if I click middle section body, you'll see that the body shiny black metal UV map is currently selected. And this means that were we to create any UVs for any other object in our scene, as long as this UV map remains selected, the UVs will go straight into that map. It won't create a new one, it won't put them anywhere else, it will put them in here. And we can utilize that by coming to our top section body, and you'll see the map disappears. But if we come over to Unwrap and click once in our viewport, we get the map back in our list, and our UVs have obviously been laid out over here on the left. So that's an easy way to get things in the same viewport. Just keep the visibility on in the background and make sure that the map is selected on that background object. So with this selected and the top section body selected, I can now turn off middle section body because we have this UV map in our list, and we can take a look at the result. And you can see it's actually not looking terrible. We haven't got any overlapping sections in here. We've got the ends curving up, and so this entire object is actually laying out fairly well in UV space. However, we need to go and check the distortion on our object, and for that we need to apply a material. So I'm going to hit space to drop the unwrap tool, hit M on our keyboard to bring up these set material options, and we're going to add in our black shiny metal material. So I'm going to click OK, and you can see that our checkers are now applied to the object. And we're getting a couple of crazy things going on. You can see right here on the front the checkers are nice and big, but they're slightly angled, and then over here on the sides the checkers are a lot smaller, and we've got a lot of strange things going on basically. I wouldn't say that the checkers are flowing nicely across any part of the object, and this suggests to me that UVing it in one big section isn't necessarily the best way forwards. Now before I go ahead and select edges for our Unwrap tool, I quickly want to explain how I'm going to be applying final decals or graphics to our final model. Now in our final model, this top section will have a few bits of graphics on it. There'll be a Canon logo running across the front there. We've got a little bit of text down there that'll say A1. The dials on top will have a little bit of graphics on as well, as will the lens. And obviously all these things are in different layers, and as I've said before, the UVs underneath these graphics will need to be laid out in a very specific way. So keeping all of those things in mind, the way I've decided to do it is to create a base map for every one of these objects, and that's what I'm doing with the body shiny black metal map. It's a base map which is laid out well, but not necessarily accurately or precisely for the graphics. We're just looking at a kind of base scratched texture. Then when I want to apply the graphics to the model, what I do is come in and select the polygons underneath the graphics, for instance this sort of polygon here underneath the A1 text. Then I'm going to create a new map, say called decals, and we'll use this map for every area where there are graphics on the model. With these polygons selected, I can come up and click say unwrap, and click once, and these polygons appear in our viewport, but they don't disappear from our body's shiny black metal map. As you can see, they're selected here, and obviously they still have a checkered texture on them in our viewport. And once we've added all of the polygons under all of the graphics into this decals map, what we can do is use Modo's shader tree to apply one material to our base UV map and one material to our decals UV map, and that's exactly what we're going to do. And I just think it's important to explain that at this point, as when we start adding edges in here and unwrapping it, we're going to get a couple of distorted results, and I just don't want you guys to worry about how we're going to be applying the final textures. So I'm going to come up and delete our decals map, as we don't want that just yet. Reselect our body shiny black metal map. Now we can go in and start selecting some edges. So I'm just going to make our 3D view a little bit bigger, like that. Just makes it a little bit easier to see what's going on. And I'm also going to turn off Advanced OpenGL. I'm going to put that back to shaded mode. Now, before I start selecting edges, I quickly want to go in and take a look at our model and kind of discern which bits can be split up into individual sections in our UV map. Now, the back section here is kind of interesting because we have this set of polygons that run across the bottom, and then they kind of flow up into this bit on the back of this box. And if we take a look at the side, you can see that they are, for the most part, kind of in line with each other on the y-axis. So what I'm going to do, I think, is try and make it so that these polygons on the left and these polygons on the right kind of flow into this section. I'm going to try and keep it connected in UV space. And that's because I want scratches on the final texture map to be able to flow from here up into here. Now I want the same thing on the front where we have this nice curve on the top here. I want scratches to be able to flow over it from this top section down onto the front. So I'm going to try and keep these polygons here and these polygons here connected in UV space. Now the final thing is we have this nice curve running around the top of the model, and because it's kind of running on the front of the camera and the back of the camera, it's in quite a noticeable place, and I don't want there to be a kind of line there where scratches suddenly stop and then they kind of start in a different place. So what I think I'm going to do is try and keep this all as one object in UV space and just let the Unwrap tool do kind of as good a job as it can without going in and selecting loops around here. So we may have to address that a little bit if it's really, really bad, but for the most part I think we'll get away with it. So what I'm going to do now is go in and start selecting edges. So first of all, I want to split off this top section, so I'm going to select some edges in here, and then tap the up arrow a couple of times until we get to this corner. I'll then continue selecting up and hit the up arrow again a couple of times, and we want to go across the top here, and you can see that worked. So I'm going to select all of these edges across the top, continue pressing up, and I want to come back around, and you see it did it, and yeah, cool. Okay, so if I hit up a couple more times, we basically have surrounded this set of polygons with an entire edge loop, and in doing so, this bit here will be completely separated from the rest of the model when we use the Unwrap tool. Now I'm going to do exactly the same thing for this set of polygons on the top, remembering that we don't want an edge running across here. We want to go all the way around this section. I'm going to do exactly the same thing for the sides, so this bit here and this bit here. I'm going to do exactly the same thing for this front section, and I'm going to come back. So as you can see, I now have these edges selected, and I'm just going to take you through them quickly. So we had that initial section, and then I've selected all the way around this kind of right hand side, and I'll just take you around that quickly. So we're going all the way down here, all the way down to this very corner. We have this weird kind of quad polygon. I've just gone to the bottom of it and then straight back up the other side. So we're going across the top past that hole, all the way along the top, then all the way down. We're just following exactly the same edge past these tries here, then all the way down to this very corner point. And then I'm coming up. We're going to put an extra edge in running around the bottom in a second, but for the moment I'm coming up past here, all the way to the very front where we reach this polygon here, where we've got these three connecting together. Then I've first gone up the front here, all the way up, all the way along, so a lot of pressing up on your keyboard, and then this is joining up all the way to the top here where we had that initial loop. Now I've done exactly the same on the other side. And I've also added in this extra edge running along the front here. So at this point, I've just run this all the way across the front, and this is just coming up around this arch, and then back, joining up to this side here. Now I'm also going to put in another edge running across the bottom, just along there. So I'm going to go in, start on this side. So remember to hold down Shift. I'm going to select that edge, then hit that edge, and then we're going to use the up arrow which I expect will work pretty well to get us all the way over to here. I'm going to zoom in on this left-hand corner and just make sure that we've connected up with this point. And we have, so that's looking pretty good to me. So at this point, if we were to UV, if we were to unwrap, all the bits which are surrounded by edges will be separated in our UV map. So let's go and take a look to see what that looks like. So I'm going to hit the Unwrap tool. I'm going to keep our iterations at 1000 for the moment. I'm going to turn on Seal Holes, and I'm just going to click once in our viewport. And you can see that we get a lot of different sections now, so I'm just going to hit space to drop the tool and take a look at them. Now first of all, we can see this bit here, which is this set of polygons on the front of the camera. So we've kept these nice and together in UV space, so the scratches will be able to flow up all the way around this curve. We've then got the two sides, which are both of these sections here. Now obviously they're rotated slightly, but you can clearly see that scratches will be able to flow nicely up over all of these polygons. Then we've got this section here, which is the underside of this arch. Now, we're not going to see most of this, but it's always good to UV everything in your model. So all of these guys will have scratches across them. Then we have this section over here, which is this little bit underneath where the flash sits. Now, we obviously have this section as well, and at the moment it's looking like a whole bunch of mess. We've got some nasty curves going on, there's some overlapping at both ends, and it does not look good. So we're going to go in and try and help it along slightly by selecting a few more edges. So I'm just going to undo until I get my edge selection back, which I hopefully will. So there you go. I'm just going to make sure we've still got these edges all nicely selected, and we have. Now we're going to help this out by selecting some edges down underneath here. Now we're not actually going to see these polygons in the final model as it's going to be covered by the lens. So adding in some edges in here, it's not going to make too much of a difference if there's a little bit of a kind of gap where the scratches suddenly stop and start. So I'm going to come in, and in edges mode, I'm just going to select these edges down here and just hit up to get to the end. Now I'll do the same thing on the other side. So I'm going to select these two, then tap up until we get to the bottom. Then I'm going to come up and try the Unwrap tool again. And you can see that things are looking a little bit better. We've got rid of a lot of those overlaps. Things are looking actually not too bad now. So I'm going to go up and turn back on our advanced OpenGL just so we can see what the textures are doing. And you can see that we're getting a much better result actually. We're still getting a couple of things wrong here where these guys are a lot smaller than the guys off to the side. But the bits that we've surrounded by edges are actually looking really good. Yes, they're a little rotated at the moment, but all of the checkers are looking the same size as you would expect. So this section here in the middle, I think that's pretty much done. I'm going to call that good. I mean, we're going to have to rotate them in a little bit, but I'm not too worried about that for now. So we now have to deal with these side sections, and you can see at the moment we're basically getting a big size difference in the checker texture as it runs across the back here, and that's where it reaches this point on our UV map. So as an experiment, I'm going to drop the tool, I'm going to turn off our advanced OpenGL quickly, and come in. I'm just going to select a couple more edges just to see what happens. I'm just going to select them right down here so we can basically follow this edge down all the way to the bottom of the model, and then do the same thing on the other side. Now, I didn't really want to do this as I want scratches to be able to flow from this section over into this section. However, if it really makes things kind of lay out a lot neater in our UV map, then it might just be something that we kind of have to deal with. So with these edges selected, I'm going to come up to our Unwrap tool and then try that again. And you can see we now get both sides kind of individually textured there, and obviously this middle section is now split differently. So I'm going to turn on our advanced OpenGL again, and you can see this back section, the checkers are now the same size as bits up here, so this is texturing really well. And yeah, the checker size is kind of being maintained much better on these side bits. So I think I'm going to leave those edges in there for now, and it might just be something that we have to deal with when it comes to texturing, but it really shouldn't be too noticeable anyway. So I'm going to hit space to drop the tool, and before we kind of deselect these edges, I'm quickly going to add them to a selection set. So I'm going to come up to select on the top menu, which again, apologize for it being off the screen, but I'm going to come down to assign selection set, and I'm just going to call this top UV edges and hit enter. So if we deselect those but we want to come back, we can come down to our statistics panel, roll down edges, roll down selection set, and just hit the plus there, and we get that selection back without having to go around and manually select all of those edges. As we're only applying a rough texture using these UV maps, we don't need these individual sections rotated or laid out in any specific way. However, what we do want are for the checkers that are on this object to be the same size as the checkers on the metal sections of both the middle section body layer and the back door section. So I'm going to bring back both of those layers and select all three together. If we come down to this middle bit, you can see that the checkers on this black section here are roughly the same size as the checkers on this top object. In fact, I think the top object checkers are maybe a little bit bigger. So what we can do is come in and select the UVs that make up the top section and slightly increase their size. However, if we try and select everything at the moment, we're also selecting things from the middle section body and the back door section. So what we can do is click on top section body. I'm just going to grab all of these UVs again, like so, and I'm just going to move these off to the side. Now in doing so, when we select all three layers together, it's quite clear to see which bits are which. And what I tend to do is organize things like this. I'll just move chunks around in UV space because they still get textured if they're outside the grid. And once the entire UV map is completed, so once everything is UV'd, I'll come back in and properly lay it out, kind of lay out the final map then, kind of utilizing as much space as I can. So with this done, I can now select this entire right section, which is the top of the model, and I'm just going to come in and just scale those up slightly, which will have the effect of making the checkers ever so slightly smaller, matching those on this section of the model. So maybe a little bit more, so a tiny bit much. That looks pretty good. Again, it doesn't have to be perfect, but you want to get it roughly correct. So you can see now, although this is a little bit angled perhaps, these are roughly the same size, and that's what we're looking for. So with our top section completely UV'd, we can now move on to the bottom section of the body. But before we do, I'm just going to come over here into UV space and lasso select around all of these polygons that are in the 1-to-1 space of our grid. And if we just give that a second, those will select. And now I'm just going to activate the move tool and move them up above the grid. Now I'm doing this because when we UV the bottom section, as we're now going to do, I don't want the new UVs to be overlapping any existing UVs in this map. So we've just moved those out of the way. Now with that done, I'm going to come over and click the visibility icon next to bottom section body, and I'm going to select that layer. Now when we do this, the UV map disappears from our UV maps list, but we now know if the polygons are still visible over here on the left, whenever we UV this object, the UVs will be placed within this existing map. So that's exactly what I'm going to do now. I'm going to come up to the Unwrap tool. I'm going to leave the iterations around about 1,000 and then click once in my viewport. Now in doing so, you can see that the bottom section body is laid out nicely in this 1-to-1 UV space. It's a little bit rotated perhaps, but that's okay for the moment. However, we can't see any distortions on this object at the moment because the checker material isn't applied. So I'm going to hit space to drop the Unwrap tool. I'm going to hit M on my keyboard, come up, and if the black shiny metal material isn't already active, you can select it from this drop down. And with black shiny metal selected, I'm going to click OK. You can now see the checkers on our object. So now that our material has been applied to this object, we can go in and take a look to see if there are any distortions. Now I've noticed that this object isn't currently in subdivision surface mode, so with no polygons selected, I'm going to hit Tab in my viewport and it will smooth out nicely. Now we can go and take a quick look around at the object, and the first thing you notice is that things are a little bit angled across here, but that's obviously quite easy to fix. We can just select these polygons in UV space and then rotate them so they lay flat, running horizontal across our map. So something like that. It doesn't need to be perfect. So that's sorted out the angle problem over here on the right. And then I'm going to go in and take a look for any weird angular distortions. And you can see at the ends here we're getting a couple of strange patterns where the checkers are kind of curving up and curving round the corner here. And that's really just a result of how things are smoothing out into 2 dimensions in UV space. And for our part, this isn't going to affect our final texturing at all. As we're just adding random scratches to this, the scratches can easily flow up from the bottom around to the sides of our model, and they're not going to really distort whatsoever. So I'm perfectly happy with the layout looking like this. And I'm just going to check the other end to make sure we're not getting anything completely odd. But I think things are looking really good. So that, believe it or not, is the bottom section completely UV'd. Now with our main body sections UV'd, we're going to move on to the lens mount group. However, before we do, I just want to make sure that this 1-to-1 UV space is clear so that when we add extra UVs into this group, they're not overlapping this bottom section. So in polygon mode, I'm just going to lasso select around all of these polygons and move them up into this top right corner. like so. Hit space to drop the tool, and we can move on. So I'm going to bring back the visibility next to our lens mount group and hide our body sections group. Now in our lens mount group we have two objects. We have the back, which is this section here, and the front, which is this section here, and they're both fairly simple objects really. There's not too much kind of complicated geometry in either of these mesh layers. The only difficult part really is probably the screw section at the bottom, but in terms of UVing it, it's actually quite a simple procedure. So I'm now going to go ahead and start selecting edges for both of these objects. So we'll start with our back object first. I'm just going to hide our front layer and then click once on the back layer. And now we can go in and start selecting some edges. So just like before, whenever we have three faces intersecting like this here, we want to basically go in and select those corner edges. So that's true of the front as well. But the important thing to note is that you're selecting all the way to the very boundary of the mesh. And you can see in this case I am. There is no polygon on this side. And there are a couple of places where we're going to have to watch out for that. Now as we come down, you could make the choice to separate this face here from this front loop. However, I'm going to keep those both in the same section of geometry. In fact, I'm going to keep all of this in the same section of geometry and try and unwrap it as one complete object, with the exception of this little screw section. So I'm going to go ahead and keep selecting these edges for the moment. So this is a corner with 1, 2, 3 faces intersecting, so I'm going to grab these guys as well. And then the same thing down here. And the same thing on the other side, like so. And you'll notice when I last selected this, something happened at the back. We selected some edges. And if we go around and take a look, you'll see that the mesh back here is actually a little different. We've got these two edges going up a little bit further into our mesh. So we have to make sure that we get all of those edges, otherwise there's no real point in selecting these. It will still be a connected section of the mesh. So we want to make sure that we select these edges all the way to the very edge of the mesh boundary. So with that in mind, we'll keep going around and select these guys as well, and make sure we select all the way to the edge boundary. Then we'll go up to the very top, and we want to select this edge as well, and these edges. And with all of those selected, we can now start work on this screw section. Now, looking at this, we have several faces intersecting. Now we have 1, 2, and 3 faces intersecting on this bit here. So you could come in and grab these edges. We have the same on the other side, but if we just leave these selected, all of this is still connected through this edge here. So it would make sense to go around and add in all of these front edges as well. So I'm just going to select a few and then tap up to get the rest. And this bit will now be UV'd completely separately from the rest of the mesh, so we should end up with 2 sections. So with that done, I'm going to come up to the Unwrap tool and click once in UV space. And I'm going to leave the iterations at about 1,000 for this one. So just click once, and as I said, you get 2 distinct sections. We get this small bit down here, which is this screw section. We get the rest of the mesh, which is actually laid out extremely nicely. We don't have any overlapping sections, and all of these bits where we added in edges have been unwrapped nicely, forming that kind of net of a cube shape that we're looking for. And that's true of all the different sections. Everything is laid out really, really nicely, so I'm very happy with that. Now, the one thing that we do want to take a look at is the fact that this has gone into a group called Texture, and the UV map selected isn't the body shiny black metal one that we were hoping for. So somehow we're going to have to get these UVs from this texture map into that body shiny black metal map. However, we'll deal with that in a second. So for now, I'm just going to quickly grab this section and rotate it slightly until it sits a little bit flatter in UV space. I'm going to grab this bottom section, and I'm just going to put that up just above the screw hole there. And that just kind of lays things out a little bit kind of more kind of ordered in UV space, which is just a nice way of looking at it. So with the back section UV, we can now bring in the front object and start selecting edges on this one as well. So with our front section selected, I'm going to hide the back section, and we can go in and start selecting edges. So I'm going to start up here at the top. I'm just going to select these 2 edges at the very back, then tap the up arrow on my keyboard to get right up to this corner. I'll move down a little bit. Now at this section we have 1, 2, 3 faces intersecting, so I'm going to grab these guys as well. And we have the same thing going on here, so I'm going to grab those guys in there. Now for the moment I'm going to come over to the other side and grab the same edges. So we want all of these at the top, remembering to select all the way to the very boundary of the mesh. I'm just going to select a few more and then tap up to get to this corner. Then we'll select the same edges down here, so we want these guys, not that back one. and we want these guys in here as well. Now the only other area in which some edges are going to need to be selected is this back section in here. And it looks a little bit more complicated, but it's really, really not too much to worry about. Now, remembering that we need things to lay out flat successfully in 2D space in our UV view, what we can do is start looking at which polygons we think should be connected together. So what we could do is come in and select these polygons and take a look at them and say, well, these ones around this loop here are kind of on the same level as these ones closer to the back, so it would make sense to keep these joined up in UV space. Now these ones running around the side here, so all of these guys, this way, so all of these guys, now this might cause us a little bit of a problem, because if we keep this attached to this and it kind of tries to lay flat, it's going to be overlapping a lot of these polygons in here. So it might make more sense to try and separate this bit out entirely by surrounding it entirely by edges. And we have a similar thing going on in the middle here. If we don't add any edges in this section and it tries to automatically lay it out flat, it's going to have a very hard time to do so, and it might end up distorting the mesh around it, and we certainly don't want that. So I'm going to try and separate out this little dip in our model as well. So flipping back to edge mode and just making sure that I've still got these edges up here selected, I'm going to come in and, remembering to hold down Shift, I'm going to grab these very corner edges and this edge running all the way around this section. So I'm just going to grab two and then tap the up arrow to get to this corner, and then select these two down here. What this has done is essentially split this curve off from the rest of the mesh. So far that's what we want. Now I'm going to do the same thing in this section. So I'm going to come in and choose where I think would be a good place to split this. Now as these polygons just in this bevel section are not necessarily perfectly flat with this top section, but they're kind of facing in roughly the same direction, I'm going to leave those as part of this top mesh. So I'm going to choose to go in and select these edges right on this join here. So I'm going to select two, tap up until we complete our selection all the way around. Now if we take a look at this bit just inside here, if we leave it as it currently is, it might have a little bit of trouble trying to unwrap it, as it's kind of a cylinder basically. So what we can do is help that out by coming in and selecting a couple of these edges running down it. And if you try and kind of picture how this is now going to be laid out, it's going to turn into something resembling a rectangle, because what we've done is split it at this point, which will separate it off and make a cylinder, and then by adding in this edge we basically unrolled that cylinder so it lies flat in UV space. So with all of these edges selected, I'm going to come up and click the Unwrap tool, and then I'm going to leave the iterations at about 1000 for now, and I'm going to click once in our UV space, and you can see that things lay out roughly as expected. We have these flaps at the top, and we have a little bit of overlap in these corners, but I'll show you where this is quickly actually. If we come up and look at this one, it's actually in this section here, and the reason for that is if you picture it, this set of faces is going to be unwrapping or folding out around this edge, and these faces are going to be folding out around this edge, and so we're going to end up with a tiny little bit of overlap in this corner. But since this is going to be covered by the back section anyway, we're not going to be really noticing that section, so I'm not too worried about a little bit of overlap right there. If we go down to the bottom, you can see that this screw section is unwrapping successfully. Now we've got a little bit of a kind of shape shift on this hole at the bottom here, so what we can do is go down and see if the seal holes option will fix that for us. If I zoom down to the bottom of the mesh quickly and turn on seal holes, what you can see is that there are some sections of our mesh that turn red. Now what the seal holes option does is it basically pretends that there is in fact a polygon in there, and you can see it's done the same thing on this front section. And what that does is it helps it maintain its shape a little better than it does if there isn't a polygon there. So that's just one option, but it doesn't seem to be doing much for our whole shape down here. I'm just going to check what it does to this middle section. And you can see it maintains its shape a little bit better. This is a little bit more squashed than I would expect it to appear. But if we turn on seal holes, it much more kind of closely resembles this shape. So I'm going to leave seal holes on. Now that we know that this section is laid out correctly, I'm just going to zoom down to the right over here and take a look at these other two sections. Now this bit on the left is basically this set of polygons that are running around this curve, and this bit on the right are the polygons that we split up in the middle of this screw hole. Now as you can see, they're not particularly rectangular at the moment, they're kind of being warped into a circular shape, And if we were putting text or any kind of geometric pattern inside here, I definitely want to go in and start trying to unwarp that and make it a little bit more rectangular. However, as we're just adding dirt and scratches, and particularly as it's in a very dark section of the final model, I'm not going to worry too much about unwarping this, but don't worry, I'm sure the technique will be covered once we start unwrapping some of the more technical parts at the top of the model. So now that we know that this is done correctly, I'm just going to slightly organize this scene a little bit better. So I'm going to hit space to drop the UV unwrap tool. I'm going to double click this set of polygons and just rotate it slightly so it lays a little bit more flat in UV space. Now with that done, I'm going to grab these guys down the bottom and just put them inside of this hole in this mesh. And this just keeps this as one nice group. Now notice over here in the UV maps list, the current UV map is called texture, and this is basically the default map that Modo will create if you try and create UVs for an object without a UV map either selected or present in your scene. And this is both a good thing and a bad thing. It's certainly a good thing because if we come up and select our back mesh as well, that was also created in this texture group, so they've essentially merged together. However, it's a bad thing because anything that merges together obviously might be overlapping as things are here. So we need to go in and fix that problem. So I'm going to select our front mesh, and for now I'm just going to bring back the visibility on our back mesh so we can see it in UV space. And with the front mesh selected, I'm going to lasso select around all of these polygons and just move them slightly up so that things no longer overlap. So we now need to go ahead and move the UVs for our lens mount section from this texture UV map into the body shiny black metal UV map that is associated with the rest of our body meshes. And there is a little bit of a trick to doing this, but it's nothing too complicated. Essentially, you want to make all of the UVs that you want to move selectable in our UV space. So we do that by selecting both the back and front lens mount meshes. So I'm just going to hold down Shift and click back. You can see all of these now become white or selectable in UV space. With that done, we now need to get the body shiny black metal UV map visible in this list here. And to do that, we come up and click the visibility icon next to our body sections group. We can then roll this down slightly, and holding down Control to add to our current item selection, I'm going to click top section body. Now you have all three of these selected, and any UV maps associated with any of these meshes are now visible in our UV maps list. So you can see the body shiny black metal map has become visible down here. So with the back, front and top section body meshes all visible, I'm going to click on the texture map, I'm going to right click it and click copy. Then I'm going to select the body shiny black metal map, right click and click paste. And you can see that the UVs now appear in our body shiny black metal map. They also currently exist in this texture map, and as we don't want two maps to exist for the same object, at least not at this point, I'm going to right click this texture map and delete it as we just don't need it anymore. So I'm going to click yes in this warning, and all of our UVs now exist in the body shiny black metal map. Now with this done, I can select both the back and the front meshes, zoom out a little bit, and we can apply our checkered material to them. So I'm going to hit M on my keyboard, I'm going to select the black shiny metal material from our drop down next to name, and with that done I'm going to click OK, and we should see the checkers appear in our viewport. So with the checkers visible, we can now go and compare their size with the checkers on the other metal parts of our meshes. So I'm going to hold down Control, click top section body, middle section body, back door section and bottom section body as well. Then we can go in and start comparing the size of the checkers and looking for any distortions on our lens mount objects. As you can see, we're getting a little bit of a distortion down here. Things are getting a little bit small towards this screw hole, but I'm not too worried about that. That is kind of an acceptable amount for our purposes. Now, things inside the screw hole are actually not looking terrible. We've got a little bit of a visible seam there, as you would expect, as we kind of split the object at that point, but we are getting a good amount of black and white in there, which means we're going to get a good array of scratches right inside that hole. Now kind of zooming around the rest of the mesh, everything looks pretty good to me, although I will say that overall the checkers look perhaps a tiny bit small. So what we can do is come in and lasso select around the polygons for our entire lens mount group. So all of these guys in here. And when they select, I'm going to activate the scale tool and just scale these down slightly. And in doing so, the checkers should get a little tiny bit bigger. And what I'm doing is just watching here and comparing it with the very top of our camera. When they look roughly the same size, so I think About there's close enough for our purposes. I'm going to hit space to drop the tool. I'm going to then activate the move tool and move all of these UVs out underneath this section of the mesh, remembering to keep the 1-to-1 section of UV space clear. So with that done, our lens mount section is now UV'd. Now at this point, all of the objects which are going to be using this body shiny black metal UV map have been completely UV'd, and you can see them over here on the left. However, they're kind of sporadically laid out at the moment, when in fact we want them to lie between a 1 and 1 in UV space, which is this top right quadrant. Now to get them there, first of all I want to make sure that all of the layers are currently selected in our items list, meaning that we have access to all of the UVs for those objects. Now making sure we have the body shiny black metal UV map selected, I can come up here and start using some of the automatic tools. So first of all I'm going to try the pack UVs function, and when this comes up I want to definitely turn off the stretch option, as we've made sure that all of these objects are kind of proportional to each other, so the checkers are kind of a similar size across all of the objects that are going to be using this map. So the stretch function is really important to turn off. However, we can keep the orient on and the pack on, and with those both in place I'm going to click OK. Then we'll have a think for a second, and it will give us our kind of first look at how a packed UV map could look. So I'm going to zoom in on this map, and if things are going a little bit slow for you, what you can do is come up and turn off Advanced OpenGL and just change that back to shaded, and hopefully things should speed up a little bit. Now as you can see, this is laid out, but I wouldn't say that it's really optimizing the space here. We've got huge chunks and huge gaps over here of just clear space, and this is not going to be a huge issue, but it is going to lower the texture resolution which is available to us. So I'm not really happy with how this is packed into the space. And at this point I'd undo, so get this kind of layout back, and I would start thinking about going in manually and moving these into position. So what I'm going to do is make this left section a little bit bigger, and then we can just start going in and grabbing groups and kind of moving them into this entire space. And what I like to try and do is lay them out and so they fill a square in total. I'm doing that so that the square that we end up with can be shrunk down quite evenly to fit in this top right section. And as soon as I start moving these about, you'll see exactly what I mean. So first of all, I'm going to grab these guys, which are the lens mount groups. I'm just going to move these over right into the bottom left section, so right as close as we can get to those dark grey lines, like that. Now with that done, I'm going to come up and grab this bit, which I think is the bottom of the mesh, and I'm going to put these just above these guys, and I'm looking to get them close but not overlapping basically. We can perhaps rotate this just a tiny little bit as well. So we want to get it really close to this grey line and close to this guy as well, but not overlapping. Like that. Then it's just a case of coming in and grabbing extra bits, and we might not be able to keep all of these guys together, but we basically want to get them and rotate them into position and then place them where we can in UV space. So I'm going to rotate that guy like that and position it right close next to there. Then I'll grab this next section, and there's no correct order to do this, and the reason that we can get away with rotating these objects is because we're applying a random texture to the final model. If this was in any way a pattern texture, we'd want to make sure that the orientation of these objects was maintained when packing these into this space, so we wouldn't go about rotating them. However, in this case we can certainly get away with doing that. So I'm just going to grab this guy and put it in here. And this is really just a case of trial and error, just trying a couple of different layouts and seeing what works, and seeing kind of how close you can pack these guys in next to each other, whilst trying to fill up a kind of final square shape. So what I'm going to do is grab this guy and just pull this down, and I think I'll rotate this like that, and then move that down just to sit on top of there. And it's really no more difficult than this. It's actually quite relaxing. If you just whack on some music in the background, this kind of stuff just flies by basically. So you just want to grab all these little bits and try and fit them into a kind of roughly square space. So at the moment I'm looking for a square probably about that by that. So I'm going to try and fill up this top section, and then if we have bits left over I'll kind of go up a little bit and out to the right a little bit further. So instead of doing this all on screen, I'm just going to cut quickly and I'll come back when I've positioned these correctly. So as you can see, I've now moved and rotated the rest of the UVs into position, and this square shape I was talking about is now much more apparent. Now please don't try and take the time to copy this UV layout exactly. There really is no right or wrong way to do this. The important bit is that you just try and utilize as much of the space as you can. So with this done and all these UVs in position, I can now go ahead and use the Fit UVs option, which if I click, we get one or two little options. I want to keep proportion. I want to make sure that's turned on and separate is turned off. And I'm just going to click OK. And you'll notice we get the same layout. It's just been squeezed up into this top right corner, and that's exactly what we want. Well guys, that's it for today. We've come quite a long way with this model, but we've got the rest of the details to add in the first video of next week, after which we'll be starting work on the textures. So yeah, I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial. If you've got any questions or comments, please leave them below. You can follow me on Twitter if you'd like. I'm at BadGranola. That's BADGRENOLA. But until next time, cheers guys.